Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Today, we're going to talk about the mystery surrounding the death of Edgar Allan Poe, one of the most beloved Gothic fiction writers of all time. He was born in 1809 and died on October 7th, 1849. He was only 40 years old. There are almost a dozen common, semi-common, and just interesting theories about how he actually died. Why are there only theories and no proof whatsoever about his actual cause of death? Well, his death certificate has never been found. For all we know, it never even existed. And the facts we do know about his death are very bizarre and confounding. One morning, he was found either in or near a bar. That's still unclear. He was semi-conscious, reeking of alcohol, wearing clothes that were clearly not his own, like oversized and mismatched. He was brought to a hospital, but he was so delirious that he couldn't explain what happened to him other than to yell the name Reynolds. It's unclear who this person was, and the last witness who claimed to have been there at the moment of his death proved himself to be entirely untrustworthy. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about his life and these fascinating theories about his death. I'm also going to talk about his hit job of an obituary, which is a fascinating read by Rufus Wilmot Griswold. This was an editor who hated Poe, who was allowed to write his official obituary. This guy was dead set on destroying Poe's reputation after he died. He was a real piece of work, and so was that obituary, so I'll read some highlights a little later. I recently read The Raven again in full. If you haven't done it in a while or ever, do yourself a favor, especially if there's a thunderstorm on the way. Oftentimes, when you hear it read, it's cut down, but to read the whole thing, beginning to end, it feels like I'm standing on the front of a fast-moving train in the middle of a foggy night that's moving much faster than trains are supposed to go. I'm a big crier. I cry all the time, and my favorite kinds of cries are when something is just so cool I don't know what to do with my emotions, so I cry. This is what The Raven does to me, not because it's sad. It is sad, but it's just so darkly human and hauntingly beautiful. I also had one of these cries while watching The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix. It's a gothic horror series entirely inspired not only by Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, but 8 different stories of his. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. I don't want to spoil anything, but I think one of my favorite scenes to ever happen on television was a scene where the father, a damned Sackler-like pharmaceutical CEO, recites The Raven. I bawled my eyes out. It was so cool and clever, I just couldn't keep it together. Sadly, though, there is not, to me, one movie about Edgar Allan Poe himself that is any good. And I'm not talking about the adaptations of his stories. Those are endless and lots of them are awesome. I'm talking about a biography. There's, of course, The Raven, starring John Cusack as a murder mystery solving Poe, which I think I made it 15 minutes in before I turned it off and watched Dracula instead. The Pale Blue Eye was also unwatchable. That's a Netflix movie which includes a young Edgar Allan Poe in military school helping again to solve murder mysteries. It was just not for me. The cinematography was really cool, and the actors did their best, but it just was not a great story overall, in my opinion. So I don't know of any other films specifically about Poe, whether he's solving murder mysteries or not. Certainly none that are just about his actual life. So please, if you do know a good one, email me at myvictoriannightmare@gmail.com. So then, let's talk a little bit about the man's life before we get into his weird and mysterious death. Poe was born in Boston as only Edgar Poe on January 19th, 1809, same year as Lincoln and Darwin. He was the second child of actors Eliza and David Poe. His mother was English-born, and his father was a deadbeat. He abandoned the family when Edgar was only 1 year old, and his mother died of tuberculosis before he was 3, so he never really knew his parents. Edgar and his 2 siblings were split up to live with other families, which is so sad. Poe was taken in as an orphan by a couple, John and Frances Allan. They never really adopted him, but they did take him in. Frances was often sick and unable to have children of her own, so they decided to adopt in hopes of raising an heir to leave their considerable amount of money to. John was a successful merchant who dealt with a number of goods, including tobacco, tombstones, and people. He was in the slave trade, who had a number of affairs and illegitimate children, which would lead to feuds between he and Edgar later in life. Sounds like a really good guy. By all accounts, Frances was a loving and kind foster mother, but John and Edgar's relationship was tense. Edgar spent a great deal of his childhood in boarding schools, and when he was around 11 years old, his already wealthy foster father became even more wealthy when his brother died and left his business to him. He now not only traded in human beings, he now owned tons of real estate. When Edgar was a teenager, he said he wanted to be a writer and attend the newly established University of Virginia, but his foster father didn't want to support him. He said, "You're not my real dad, I'm going to put myself through college then," with gambling, which didn't go so well. In fact, Thomas Jefferson founded that school and designed a school system of self-government which allowed the students to create their own curriculum, pick their dorms, and tell on each other when any student was caught with a gun, a horse, tobacco, or alcohol. Gambling was also against the rules, and none of these rules were really enforced. The school was apparently in chaos when Poe attended and had a very high dropout rate. Jefferson's foray into education didn't last long, I imagine. He reached out to his foster father and begged him to please support his schooling, which begrudgingly he actually did end up giving him some money, enough for clothes and to register for classes. But having attempted to put himself through college by gambling, he now had loads of gambling debts he was hoping he'd pay for him too, which he did not, and they became estranged. His foster mother died, his foster father remarried, and he was essentially cut off from the family entirely and had to make it on his own. He dropped out, left Richmond, and took a job as a newspaper writer and clerk in Boston in April 1827. He gave himself the pen name Henri Le Renette at this time. The money he made at the newspaper wasn't enough to support himself, so he joined the army under a false name, which I would imagine would be some kind of felony. He called himself Edgar A. Perry. He said he was 22, even though he was only 18, and he made $5 a month serving at Fort Independence in Boston, which is equivalent to only about $133 a week in today's money. So he was still definitely struggling, but not for long. He actually moved up the ranks and did better for himself, but decided he wanted to continue to better himself and moved on eventually to West Point. Poe had started writing poetry and even a 40-page collection of poems published at this time. Only 50 copies were made, and it didn't get any attention. But then he received what he called the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard from a well-known critic named John Neal. He dedicated one of his poems to him in his second book that was published in 1829. While at West Point, his foster father officially disowned him after their relationship crumbled around his new wife and quarrels about all the illegitimate children his father had. He got himself court-martialed. One of the crimes for his court-martialing was not going to church, which is interesting. But this is so sweet. The cadets at the school pooled money to help him publish a book of poems called simply Poems. For 75 cents apiece, they pulled $170 for the cause. That was equivalent to about $4,500. That was really nice of them. He must have been pretty liked by his fellow classmates among all the chaos. He then went to stay with his biological brother, cousin, and aunt after that. Glad to know that he reconnected with his siblings later in life, but sadly, his brother died of alcoholism that same year. After his brother's death, he decided to really dive into writing, but this was a tough time for writers. Publishers didn't pay very much. This is when he decided to write short story content, and he won a prize for a story he wrote called MS Found in a Bottle. A rich guy named John P. Kennedy, no relation to the other John Kennedy, took notice and helped him place some stories in the Southern Literary Messenger back in Richmond. Things were looking up, until he was fired for being drunk on the job. They forgave him, though, and rehired him shortly before marrying his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia. He was 27 years old. let's talk about his marriage to his 13-year-old cousin. There is a disagreement about the nature of this relationship between biographers. Some biographers insist that they believe the marriage was never consummated. Some believe Poe was just a pedophile. Some believe Poe was never really interested in women at all. There seems to be credible evidence for all of these scenarios. They first met after his discharge from West Point. Poe moved in with her and 4 other family members, an aunt and cousins. He got a crush on a neighbor, and little Virginia would actually bring her Poe's love letters, and even brought back some of her hair for him. But this crush eventually fizzled. Poe left this family not too long after to work in Richmond again, and another cousin got wind that Poe wanted to marry Virginia. People in the family didn't agree with this, so it wasn't normal that he wanted to marry this 12-year-old even at that time. This cousin offered to take her in and send her to school, but this made Poe full of rage. He called this cousin his bitterest enemy and wrote a letter pleading with Virginia's mother to let her marry him. He had a new job now and offered to pay to support her and Virginia if they would be allowed to marry. So they did, on September 22nd, 1835. Close friends of the couple said they never shared a bed until she was 16. Poe himself said, quote, "I see no one among the living as beautiful as my little wife." She also wrote him poetry, and by all accounts idolized him and sat close to him while he wrote. Although there are disagreements about the exact nature of this relationship, it's widely believed that Virginia is most likely the inspiration for Annabel Lee in the poem called Annabel Lee, which I will read you a few passages from. "It was many and many year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted, her and me. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the nighttide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the surrounding sea." Sorry, I get kind of choked up when I read that. Which brings us to her very tragic death. Like so many other family members in both hers and his families, she slowly died of tuberculosis. It's said that while singing at the piano, she started to cough up blood, although Poe said she merely had a broken blood vessel. This was the beginning of her decline. She became invalid, which caused Poe to fall into a deep depression, especially when it would appear as though she was recovering, only to fall deeper into sickness. He said in a letter, "Each time I felt all the agonies of her death, and at each ascension of the disorder I loved her more dearly and clung to her life with more desperate pertinacity. But I am constitutionally sensitive, nervous in a very unusual degree. I became insane, with long intervals of horrible sanity." Although at this time, Poe became embroiled in an affair of sorts, he began flirting with a poet by the name Francis Sargent Osgood. Virginia didn't seem to mind this friendship, though. Apparently her presence would keep Poe from drinking, so that must have been nice. He could never hold his liquor. In fact, he was a notorious lightweight and would get embarrassingly sloppy after 1 or 2 drinks. Another female poet, Elizabeth Elliot, became enamored with Poe and jealous of Francis. Poe was not at all interested in Elizabeth. In fact, he said her love was, quote, loathsome, and, quote, he could do nothing but repel it with scorn. Harsh. After much drama, she tried to spread rumors that Poe was insane and his friends were about to have him committed. And poor little Virginia was being torn apart by all of this. On her deathbed, she said that Elizabeth Elliot had really been the one who killed her. This poor girl. She wrote Edgar a poem at this time that's going to break your heart. I'll read a few lines, the best I can. "Ever with thee I wish to roam. Dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home and a rich old cypress vine. Removed from the world with its sin and care and the tattling of many tongues. Love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see Perfect ease we'll enjoy, without thinking to lend ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful we'll be. The tattling of many tongues was thought to be a reference to all the drama that Elizabeth Elliot was causing. 2 years before her death, while she was already quite ill, they moved to Philadelphia in the 1840s, and you can actually visit their home today. They moved from this home to New York, but while Poe was securing a place to live there, she admitted, quote, "I know I shall die soon. I know I can't get well, but I want to be as happy as possible and make Edgar happy." She promised her husband that after her death she would be his guardian angel. And this time, Poe began drinking more heavily to cope with her illness. And on January 29th, 1845, Poe published The Raven. It appeared in the Evening Mirror, and almost instantly, Poe became a household name. It was a sensation. However, he was paid only $9 to write it. That's only about $100 in today's currency. By 1846, Virginia's symptoms became flushed cheeks, unstable pulse, night sweats, sudden chills, fever, shortness of breath, pains in her chest, coughing, and coughing of blood. She died on January 30th, 1847. She had helped in arranging her own funeral and even purchasing the coffin. Poe refused to look at her face after she died, including at the funeral, but a lovely portrait was painted of her a few hours after her death as a memento mori. Although this might sound creepy, it is, but it was very common to have a family member painted once they died. It may be the only image a family had of a loved one. I speak at length about these post-mortem keepsakes of the Victorian era, these memento mori, in the Victorian Cult of Death episode, so check that out. Years after Poe's death, his remains were moved from its original spot. I'll talk about exactly why in a bit. But Virginia's remains that were close by were marked to be destroyed when his was moved. So it's going to make me cry. One of Poe's biographers collected her bones himself as they were being dug up and kept them in a box until they could be buried beside Poe in his newer, more prominent resting place in a small bronze casket of her own. After this, Poe's life became very unstable. He attempted to court poet Sarah Helen Whitman, but her mother intervened, likely due to his now serious alcoholism and erratic behavior. 2 years after the death of Virginia, Poe travels to Richmond for 2 months to seek out a magazine position, and while he was there, he stopped in to see a doctor. He described to the doctor that he was suffering from cholera. He said he was also having hallucinations and insisted that he was not drinking anymore. He gave a few very well-received lectures while he was there. He left on September 27th to return to New York to marry his childhood sweetheart, but he didn't make it to New York. On October 3rd, he was discovered delirious in Baltimore, either near or inside Gunner's Hall Tavern. Again, it's still unclear. A man named Joseph W. Walker recognized him. He collected him and sent a letter requesting help to a friend of Poe's, Joseph E. Snodgrass. Now, there's a strange inconsistency here. It said that Poe was unable to say what happened to him or how he got there because he was just simply too delirious, but he was able to tell this man he had a friend, Joey Snodgrass, and was able to give him an exact address because this letter did arrive to him. So that seems a little strange to me. Regardless, Snodgrass came to see him in the hospital. His description of Poe was that he was, quote, repulsive, with unkempt hair, a haggard, unwashed face, and lustrous and vacant eyes. He described his clothes as a dirty shirt with no vest and unpolished shoes. They were worn and they did not fit well. This describes half the guys I know currently, but this was not normal at the time. In fact, it led Snodgrass to the conclusion that these were not his clothes at all. His doctor, John Joseph Moran, had a more specific description. It was a stained, faded, old bombazine coat, pantaloons of a similar character, a pair of worn-out shoes run down at the heels, and an old straw hat. A bombazine coat was a high-collared button-down coat that could go as low as mid-calf. Sometimes it would have tails. From this point on, it's said that Poe couldn't stay coherent enough to say much of anything. His doctor had him confined to a section of the hospital that had bars on the windows reserved for drunk people. Apart from Snodgrass, he wasn't allowed any visitors. It's said that he repeatedly called out the name Reynolds the night before he died, but no one has been able to discover exactly who that was. There are theories, though, but they're tied to the cause of death theories, which I'll get to in a moment. There are other things this Dr. Moran said Poe said as he was fading in and out of consciousness. Moran told him he would allow friends to come visit, and Poe, according to Moran, said, quote, "The best thing his friend could do would be to blow his brains out." Again, if Poe could make that clear a statement, why couldn't he even give a clue what happened? The doctor also said Poe's last words were, "Lord help my poor soul." He died on October 7th, 1849. This doctor's credibility in many ways has come into question over the years and regarded just about everything Poe said while he was there, including his last words. He was the only person to see him after Snodgrass, and in lectures he would give years later, his story of the entire encounter would change dramatically. Poe's supposed last words changed from "Lord help my poor soul" to "The arched heavens encompass me, and God has his decree legibly written upon the frontlets of every created human being and demons incarnate. Their goal will be the seething waves of blank despair." Again, not likely by any accounts. That's also kind of like if a Victorian middle school girl interpreted what she thinks Poe's writing sounded like. No disrespect to Victorian middle school girls. It's, again, not likely. For all this doctor had plenty of lectures to give about Poe's death, he didn't even write up a death certificate or write any medical records while he was there. Poe's funeral was on October 8th in 1849 in Baltimore. It was sparsely attended with a few family members, Snodgrass, a classmate, and a former teacher. The funeral lasted 3 minutes, and the weather was described by an attendee as, quote, "A dark and gloomy day, not raining, but just kind of raw and threatening. The Reverend decided not to bother with a sermon because the crowd was so small." Damn it. Poe was buried in a cheap coffin with no handles, no fabric lining, and no pillow for his head, and not even a headstone was placed. But there was an insane reason for that. His cousin did pay for a headstone, but it was destroyed when a train derailed and plowed through the monument yard where the stone was being kept before the funeral. Jesus. So he was given a sandstone block that just read the number 80. In 1875, however, a Southern poet named Paul Hamilton Hayne petitioned to have a proper monument created for him and wrote an article describing how sad the state of his burial place was. This inspired an outpouring of financial support, and about $1,500 was raised. That's about $40,000 in today's money. Poe's cousin Nielsen Poe and Snodgrass attended, as well as Walt Whitman. Alfred Lord Tennyson couldn't make it, but he wrote a poem for the ceremony that read, "Fate that once denied him, and envy that once decried him, and malice that belied him, now cenotaph his name." A cenotaph is a monument to someone buried elsewhere, like a person who died in a war. Virginia's bones were also moved to lay beside Poe during this reburial. Before we get to the theories surrounding his death, I gotta read you some passages from Poe's obituary written by a total jerk who signed his obituary only Ludwig. It turns out this Ludwig was a man by the name of Rufus Wilmot Griswold. He was a former colleague of Poe's. It's unclear why this guy had such a huge grudge against him, but after writing a very mean obituary, he went on to smear Poe in every way that he could. A few passages from his obituary read as follows. It starts off kind of nice. Edgar Allan Poe died in Baltimore on Sunday last. His was one of the very few original minds that this country has produced. In the history of literature, he will hold a certain position and a high place. By the public of the day, he is regarded rather with curiosity than with admiration. Many will be startled, but few will be grieved by the news. He had very few friends, and he was the friend of very few, if any. He continues, Mr. Poe left West Point without graduating, and here commenced his disastrous battle of life in 1831. He printed a small volume of poems, his first brochure. They were favorably received by the reviewers and well spoken of by their few readers. Over the last 2 years, he has been seen now and then about Richmond, generally in a state very unbecoming to a man of genius. But during his last visit, for nearly 2 months' duration, he has been perfectly himself, neatly dressed, and exceedingly agreeable in his deportment. He then goes on to mention the very well-received lectures that he gave in those last 2 months in Baltimore, but throws this in there. Quote, "He had another errand. Some rich woman named Mrs. St. Leon Loud had died, leaving verses. Her husband, Mr. St. Leon Loud, wanted Poe to prepare them for the press, make a memoir, etc. He knew nothing about them save their good price, and he was going on for the job. Death cut him short in Baltimore. The newspapers say he died of congestion of the brain." And that is the end of the obituary. This guy later went on a sadly successful smear campaign of Poe and wrote a biography of him that was so full of lies that depicted him as a depraved drunk, drug-addled fiend. This was the only biography of Poe at the time, so Griswold's depictions were largely believed to be true all the way up until 1941. When a man named Arthur Hobson Quinn presented evidence that Griswold forged letters supposedly written by Poe and used them as his sources for the biography, making him appear like a depraved madman. Unfortunately, these depictions have had lasting effects on how people think of Poe, although many biographies from far more reputable sources have been working to undo that for a long time. So, without further ado, let's get to these theories about how he actually died. It's important to note that although one of these theories is considered the most likely, still to this day, no one knows and they can't know. All known stones have been left unturned. Poe left us with a mystery we can never solve. But boy, have people tried. So first, suicide. Poe was never the same after the death of his wife Virginia, and he had a good 2-3 year slow but very public decline. There have been psychological evaluations of his language around the time of his death, and it's theorized that he was in the middle of a major depressive episode, and he had also, a year earlier, nearly died of an overdose of laudanum, that's a painkiller. It's unclear if this was intentional even at that time. The general consensus is that although depression perhaps played a role in his death, there are too many other strange occurrences. The strange clothes, for example, that suggests something else more likely happened. Next, alcoholism. It is very true that Poe was a serious alcoholic at the time, and it was his buddy Joey Snodgrass's opinion that that's what killed him, and he was very vocal about that. But Joey was a member of the Temperance Union, and he was known to invoke Poe's name when evangelizing about the dangers of alcohol, so his opinion was biased at best. Interestingly, the severity of Poe's drinking is also disputed. His friends didn't describe him as being more of a drunk than they were, but they did say that it didn't take much to get him drunk. Some friends said that it would take only 1 glass of wine to make him tipsy. It's believed he only drank seriously at times of great distress, but then would have periods of sobriety. He was also a member of the Sons of Temperance, which is a little confusing, but not really. Temperance clubs were all the rage at the time, and it's very likely that he joined because he wanted to stop drinking and find some kind of support group, which many of these groups were to a degree. But historians all tend to agree that the way in which he died, the amount of time it took to die, are not consistent with a death due to alcoholism, although alcohol clearly played a part. Next, cholera. A few days before this situation, he did go to the doctor. He did say he had cholera and was experiencing hallucinations. Hallucinations are a late-stage symptom of cholera. So some theorize that he was just in a late stage of it, and he was also found stinking of alcohol. Maybe he was already on death's door, and a heavy night of drinking just pushed him over the edge, and his body couldn't fight after that. But again, the clothes. Still too many question marks there. So next. Beating. A biographer of his in 1867, E. Oakes Smith, wrote in an article a lot of unsubstantiated facts that are very specific. She said that while he was in Baltimore, Poe either insulted, injured, or came onto a woman who wasn't having it, and a man that was with her beat him up in the streets. Very specific, but no witnesses or evidence are mentioned in our article. Another biographer suggests he was beaten by simply, quote, ruffians before his death. Again, no evidence or witness statements, and neither the doctor nor Snodgrass describe any bruises or injuries on him specifically, so this theory is on the least likely side simply because there's nothing to prove any of it whatsoever. Next, mercury poisoning. Not a bad theory. He did say he had cholera, and what did people with cholera take? They took mercury. And what are the symptoms of mercury poisoning? Impaired sensations, irritability, delirium, mood swings, also tremors, headaches, breathing difficulties. Not great. Poe's hallucinations could have been because of cholera or the mercury that was being used to treat it. Strands of Poe's hair were tested in 1999, and there were elevated levels of mercury, but still 30 times lower than the level consistent with mercury poisoning. Not sure if mercury fades over time in hair follicles, but regardless, this theory is still on the less likely side, but still could have definitely potentially have been a factor, especially in regard to his inability to communicate properly and his inability to stay fully conscious. Next, typhoid. Now, it's true that Poe said he thought he had cholera, but it's also possible that he had typhoid. There was a mass migration of Irish immigrants during the potato famine in 1847 to New York and Philadelphia, and many of them contracted typhoid either before they left or on the cramped boats on the way there. This caused an uptick in cases in New York and Philadelphia at the time. Some of the most common symptoms of typhoid were central nervous system dysfunction, slurred speech, and losing control of muscle movements, consistent with Poe's symptoms, but again, still doesn't explain the clothes or the reeking of alcohol. There are so many other theories ranging from murder to a brain tumor, carbon monoxide to rabies, but at least as of now, the most accepted theory by historians was something called cooping. This theory explains it all. Everything from why he was terribly drunk, why his clothes weren't his, why he was found where he was, everything except a definitive cause of death, but a very likely explanation of everything leading up to it. Cooping was a form of forced voter fraud in the mid-1800s. It was very common, and it involved a political candidate employing thugs to kidnap people off the street, bring them to a room that they couldn't get out of, otherwise known as a coop, and explain to them that they were now going to multiple polling places and vote for their candidate. If they didn't comply, they'd either be beaten or they'd get them drunk, or both, and drag them around town from polling place to polling place. The victims would be taken to the same places over and over, only they'd be given disguises like wigs, fake beards, and they would have to change their clothes. This was also done to force people to enlist in the army during the Civil War. This was such a prevalent practice that a general complained that the men that were enlisting were clearly tricked into it and had no business being in the army. Back to Poe. It's believed that he was likely pulled off the street, given lots of booze, and taken around repeatedly to vote. It was also common for polling places to hand out beers after people voted. So not only was he likely already drunk when he started, but he drank more and more at each place. And when the night was done, the thugs just left him at the tavern, which, not coincidentally, was an election polling place the night before. And remember that name Reynolds that Poe was heard to yell once he got to the hospital? One of the guys minding the polls at the tavern where he was found was named Henry R. Reynolds. That must have blown the mind of the historian who put all these pieces together when he found out that tidbit. That's incredible. Maybe Poe was trying to say, ask that guy. He saw what happened. It's possible he did get alcohol poisoning. Perhaps he was already suffering from an illness, and all of these factors together led to his demise. This is the most accepted theory. Poor Edgar voted himself to death. So that was awful. As always, I am so sorry for telling you all of these things. But here's something to make you feel a little better. Poe didn't write a lot of happy poems, but one of my very favorites happens to be such a sweet ode to the evening star. To me, it's a reminder to appreciate small points of beauty. 'Twas noontide of summer, and mid-time of night, and stars in their orbits shone pale through the light of the brighter, cold moon, mid-planets her slaves, herself in the heavens, her beam on the waves. I gazed a while on her cold smile, too cold for me. There passed as a shroud a fleecy cloud, and I turned away to thee. Proud evening star, in thy glory afar, and dearer thy beam shall be, for joy to my heart is the proud part thou bearest in heaven at night, and more I admire thy distant fire than that colder, lowly light. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate, review, and subscribe. Be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you in your nightmares.